On October 5, 2023, what began as a prestigious gala in Cleveland, Ohio, celebrating the success of Solis Innovations ended in shock and tragedy. Darren Blake, 42-year-old co-founder of the company, was found dead in the lounge of the luxury hotel hosting the event. The evening, meant to showcase innovation and ambition, descended into chaos as betrayal, jealousy, and simmering tensions between Darren and his business partner, Michael Solis, reached a boiling point. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of months of secrets, broken trust, and personal conflicts hidden beneath the surface of their celebrated partnership. To understand how it all led to that fateful night, we must go back to where it all started. Michael Solis had always been the type to think big and back it up with action. Back in his early 30s, he teamed up with his best friend, Darren Blake, to start Solis Innovations. They were just two guys with a bold idea and enough ambition to take on the world. It wasn't some overnight success story. They started small, working out of a cramped office with no air conditioning and a second-hand coffee maker that only worked half the time. For years, they sacrificed weekends, put in 12-hour days, and poured everything they had into building the company. Slowly but surely, their hard work paid off. By their mid-40s, they'd made it. Solis Innovations wasn't just another tech company. It was a powerhouse in consumer technology. Their products were everywhere, and in Cleveland, Ohio, they were practically local celebrities. The media loved their story. Two best friends turned co-founders, creating cutting-edge products while staying grounded. Michael was the brains behind the business side. He was organized, sharp, and relentless when it came to growth. If there was a deal to be made or a problem to solve, Michael was the guy who'd figure it out. Darren, on the other hand, was the creative genius. He had a knack for turning wild ideas into something real, and people loved him for it. Together, they were the perfect team. Friends, colleagues, and clients often joked that they were like brothers. For years, that wasn't far from the truth. At company events, they were inseparable. They'd laugh, share old stories about their early days, and talk about their vision for the future. Michael loved reminiscing about the time Darren convinced him to pitch their first big client while wearing mismatched socks, or how they once worked through the night because a prototype had failed hours before a presentation. Those were the good times, the moments that made the struggles worth it. But, as they say, money changes everything. It didn't happen overnight. At first, the cracks were small, almost invisible. Darren started making little comments, usually after a few drinks at events. "Guess you're the face of the company now," he'd say with a tight smile, or, "Another magazine cover, huh? Must be nice." Michael would laugh it off, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. Darren had always been a bit sensitive about not getting enough credit, but Michael figured it was just harmless venting. Then, there were the expenses. Darren had always been a spender, but over time, Michael started noticing how much Darren was dipping into company funds for what he called business expenses. There were charges for luxury hotels, designer watches, and extravagant dinners that didn't seem to have much to do with work. Michael told himself Darren had earned it. After all, they'd built the company together, and maybe Darren just wanted to enjoy the perks of their success. Still, it gnawed at him. Emma, Michael's wife, seemed to notice the tension too. She'd always been supportive of Michael's work, even when it meant long hours and late nights. At 38, she was the glue that held their home life together, always making sure Michael stayed grounded. She'd step in whenever she sensed something was off between him and Darren, inviting Darren over for dinners or hosting small gatherings where they could relax and talk things out. "You two have been through too much to let little things get in the way," Emma would say. And for a while, it worked. Darren would crack jokes, Emma would laugh, and Michael would feel like things were back to normal. But then, the comments started coming from other people. At a barbecue Michael hosted, one of his buddies nudged him and said, "Man, doesn't it seem like Darren's here more than you are?" Another friend joked, "Darren's practically family now, huh?" Michael laughed along with them, but the remarks stuck in his mind. He started paying more attention to how much time Darren and Emma spent talking at these gatherings. It wasn't anything overt, but they always seemed to drift toward each other, getting into long conversations while Michael was busy entertaining guests or handling the grill. At first, he shrugged it off. They were friends, after all. Darren had been there since the beginning, and Emma had always been kind to him. But the more Michael noticed, the harder it became to ignore. The real crack came during a big company event, a product launch for one of their latest innovations. The night was a success from start to finish. Investors were impressed, the press loved what they saw, and the mood in the room was celebratory. Michael gave a heartfelt speech, thanking Darren for his creativity and their team for their hard work. Afterward, people congratulated him, shaking his hand and patting him on the back. At one point, Michael went looking for Darren to share the moment with him. He found him near the far end of the ballroom, talking to Emma. From where Michael stood, their body language seemed off. Darren's arms were crossed, his posture stiff. Emma was gesturing with her hands, her expression tense. Michael couldn't hear what they were saying, but it didn't look like a casual conversation. For a moment, he thought about walking over to ask what was going on, but something held him back. Instead, he stood there, watching from a distance. When Darren finally noticed him, the conversation stopped abruptly. Emma quickly excused herself, heading toward the bar, while Darren walked over with his usual easygoing smile plastered on his face. "Great night, huh?" Darren said, as if nothing had happened. Michael nodded, forcing a smile of his own, but the uneasiness stayed with him. He wanted to ask Darren what that conversation was about, but something told him he wouldn't get a straight answer. Instead, he brushed it aside, telling himself he was overthinking things. But that night, as Michael lay awake in bed, the memory of their tense conversation played on a loop in his mind. Darren wasn't just his business partner. He was his best friend. And Emma wasn't just his wife. She was supposed to be his anchor. For the first time, Michael felt like he was on the outside looking in, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The uneasiness grew over the following weeks. Small moments began to feel significant. Michael started noticing how Darren and Emma always seemed to gravitate toward each other at events, or how they exchanged subtle glances when they thought no one was looking. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself it was all in his head, but deep down, he knew better. What Michael didn't realize was that these cracks in his relationships weren't going to heal on their own. They were about to split wide open, and nothing would ever be the same again. Michael Solis couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. After the product launch, when he saw Darren and Emma talking in hushed tones, he had told himself to let it go. Darren was his best friend, and Emma was his wife. There was no reason to question their loyalty. But the longer he thought about it, the harder it became to ignore the uneasy feeling in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't just that one conversation. Darren had been acting differently for months, and Emma seemed more distant every day. Michael tried to chalk it up to stress. They were all under a lot of pressure with Solis innovations growing so quickly. But the little things started to pile up, and they were hard to ignore. The first real blow came when Michael overheard a casual comment at work. A colleague mentioned that Darren had been meeting with investors alone, pitching ideas for new projects. At first, Michael brushed it off. Darren was always networking, and it wasn't unusual for him to have private conversations with potential partners. But then Michael heard specifics about the ideas Darren was pitching, and they sounded suspiciously like Solis Innovations' next big product line. Michael decided to confront Darren about it. One afternoon, he walked into Darren's office and shut the door behind him. "I heard you've been meeting with investors," Michael said, trying to keep his tone neutral. Darren didn't even look up from his desk. "Yeah, I've been feeling out the market," he said casually. "It's good to know what people are interested in." "Why?" Michael crossed his arms, his frustration bubbling just below the surface. "Because those ideas you're pitching aren't just random concepts. They're projects we've been developing here, together." Darren finally looked up, his expression annoyed. "Relax, Michael. It's not like I'm stealing anything. I'm just getting a sense of what's out there. You know, keeping people excited about what's coming next." Michael stared at him, searching for some kind of reassurance, but Darren's tone was dismissive, like it was no big deal. "You should have told me," Michael said finally. Darren leaned back in his chair and shrugged. "You're too uptight about this stuff. It's just networking." Michael walked out of the office feeling anything but reassured. Darren's behavior wasn't just careless, it felt deliberate. For the first time, Michael started to wonder if Darren was pushing boundaries on purpose, testing how much he could get away with. Things weren't much better at home. Emma had always been his rock, the person he could lean on when things got tough at work. But lately, she'd been distant. She spent more time working late or planning solo trips to unwind. When Michael brought it up, she'd brush him off, saying he was overthinking it. "Not everything is about you, Michael," she snapped once when he pressed her about it. Michael wanted to believe her, but he couldn't ignore how often Emma and Darren seemed to find reasons to talk at events or gatherings. It wasn't anything overt, just little moments that added up. At a company barbecue, Michael's brother-in-law joked, "Looks like Darren's here more than you are these days." Another friend teased, "I swear, Darren and Emma are the real dream team." They were harmless comments, but they struck a nerve. The breaking point came during a formal gala for Solis Innovations. It was supposed to be a celebration, a night to show investors how far the company had come and get them excited for the future. Michael spent weeks preparing his speech, making sure every detail was perfect. The night started well. Michael delivered his speech flawlessly, thanking the investors, the employees, and, most of all, Darren, for his creativity and hard work. The room erupted into applause, and for a brief moment, Michael felt a sense of pride in what they'd built together. Then Darren took the stage. At first, his remarks were light-hearted and charming, exactly what Michael expected. But then Darren's tone shifted. "Michael's done a great job leading this company," Darren said, his voice pleasant but with a sharp edge. "But let's not forget where the magic happens, on the creative side. That's where the real breakthroughs are made." The audience chuckled politely, but Michael felt his jaw tighten. Darren continued, going on about his role in the company and how his ideas had driven their success. He didn't explicitly discredit Michael, but the implication was clear. Darren was the real brains behind Solis Innovations. By the time Darren finished, Michael was furious. He waited until the gala was winding down to confront him. Finding Darren by the bar, Michael walked up and said, "What the hell was that speech?" Darren turned, his expression calm. "What are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," Michael snapped. "That whole creative side thing. You made it sound like I'm just some paper pusher while you're the genius running the show." Darren shrugged, his casual demeanor only fueling Michael's anger. "I was just being honest. You can't take everything so personally, Michael." Michael stared at him, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "This isn't about being personal. It's about respect. You don't undermine me in front of investors." Darren sighed, like he was tired of the conversation. "You're overreacting. I didn't undermine you. I just gave credit where it's due." Michael wanted to keep arguing, but he could tell it was pointless. Darren wasn't going to admit he'd done anything wrong, and Michael didn't have the energy to keep pushing. Later that night, Michael saw Emma and Darren talking near the bar. From a distance, they didn't look tense or upset. If anything, they looked comfortable. Emma leaned in close, her hand briefly brushing Darren's arm. Darren said something that made her laugh softly, and Michael felt his stomach drop. He told himself it was nothing, just a friendly conversation. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. Over the next few days, Michael tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that his suspicions were unfounded. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The cracks in his life were growing, and he was starting to realize that they weren't going to fix themselves. Michael Solis had always prided himself on being a rational man, someone who thought things through before jumping to conclusions. But the last few weeks had been testing his patience and sanity. The subtle signs of betrayal, Emma's distance, Darren's dismissive behavior, the strange body language at gatherings, were becoming harder to ignore. Michael didn't want to believe there was anything going on between his wife and his best friend, but the cracks in their stories were starting to show. One evening, while searching for some documents he thought Emma had left in her car, Michael found something that stopped him cold. Tucked inside the glove compartment was a stack of receipts, most of them for items he didn't recognize. There was a charge for an expensive dinner at a high-end restaurant they'd never been to together, a purchase for a bracelet from a luxury jeweler, and even a hotel reservation under Emma's name. Michael felt his chest tighten as he sifted through the papers. He tried to convince himself that there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Emma had been helping a friend or buying a gift for someone else. But as he stared at the dates on the receipts, He realized they aligned suspiciously with the times she'd claimed to be working late or unwinding on her solo trips. When he confronted her that night, Emma's reaction only deepened his suspicions. She didn't deny the receipts were hers, but immediately went on the defensive. "Why are you digging through my stuff, Michael?" she snapped, crossing her arms. "Don't you trust me?" "I'm asking because these don't make sense," Michael replied, holding up the receipts. "Who are you going to these dinners with? And what about this bracelet? I didn't buy that for you." Emma rolled her eyes, her tone sharp. "It's work-related. I don't tell you about every meeting I have because I know how you get, always jumping to conclusions. I can't believe you'd even ask me this." Her words stung, but what hurt more was the way she refused to look him in the eye. Michael dropped the conversation for the night, but the seeds of doubt were firmly planted. A few days later, Michael got a call from one of his most trusted employees, Sarah. She had worked with Solis Innovations from the beginning and had always been loyal to Michael. What she told him sent his mind reeling. "Michael, I think you should know something," Sarah said cautiously. "I've noticed some irregularities with the company accounts. Darren's been moving money into a separate account under his name. At first, I thought it was just for operational expenses, but it doesn't add up." Michael's blood ran cold. "How much money are we talking about?" "A lot," Sarah replied. "I don't have the full picture yet, but it's enough to raise a red flag. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, but I thought you should know." Michael thanked her, hanging up the phone with his head spinning. Darren wasn't just pitching their ideas to investors behind his back. He was skimming money from the company. Between that and Emma's behavior, Michael felt like the walls were closing in on him. His paranoia reached its peak a week later when Emma told him she had a business dinner to attend. She didn't offer any details, which only made Michael more suspicious. That night, instead of staying home, he decided to follow her. Michael parked a few blocks away from the restaurant she had mentioned and waited. It wasn't long before he saw her step out of her car, dressed to the nines, and walk inside. A few minutes later, Darren arrived. Michael watched as they greeted each other at the door. Emma smiled, and Darren placed his hand on the small of her back as they walked to their table. Michael felt a wave of anger and humiliation wash over him. He wanted to march into the restaurant and confront them right then and there, but he held back, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Instead, he waited until they finished their meal and followed them out. "Emma," he called out as they walked to their cars. Emma froze, her face pale as she turned to see him. Darren's expression was a mix of shock and annoyance. "Michael, what are you doing here?" Emma stammered. "I could ask you the same thing," Michael shot back, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You said this was a business dinner. Care to explain why Darren's here?" Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Darren jumped in. "Calm down, Michael. You're making this into something it's not. We were discussing some things about the company. At a romantic restaurant?" Michael snapped. "Cut the crap, Darren. I'm not blind." Emma tried to defuse the situation, stepping closer to Michael. "You're overreacting," she said, her voice pleading. "There's nothing going on. I swear." Michael didn't believe a word of it. He stormed off, leaving them standing there, but the image of them together burned in his mind. The next day, Michael confronted Darren in the office. He slammed the door shut and wasted no time getting to the point. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded. Darren leaned back in his chair, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb," Michael snapped. "I know about the money. I know about Emma. You've been lying to me for months." Darren's expression darkened, but he kept his tone calm. "Michael, you're losing it. You're paranoid, and you're starting to embarrass yourself. If you keep throwing around these wild accusations, you're going to destroy everything we've built." "Don't you dare talk to me about destroying things," Michael said, his voice shaking. "You've been cheating with my wife and stealing from our company. You're a fraud, Darren." Darren stood, his calm facade cracking. "Watch yourself, Michael. If you keep this up, I'll dissolve this partnership and take half of Solis Innovations with me. Do you really want to go down that road?" Michael stared at him, his fists clenched. He wanted to throw a punch, to wipe that smug look off Darren's face, but he held himself back. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth before walking out of the office. As Michael left, he couldn't shake the feeling that Darren wasn't bluffing. The betrayal was real, and the damage was already done. But Michael wasn't about to let Darren walk away without a fight. Michael Solis couldn't sleep. Every night, his mind ran in circles, replaying the events of the last few weeks. Darren's betrayal, Emma's lies, and the growing tension at Solis Innovations consumed him. He had worked too hard to let everything fall apart now. But confronting Darren head-on hadn't worked. It had only made things worse. If Michael wanted to take Darren down, he needed to be smart about it. That's when he decided to play the long game. Quietly, Michael began gathering evidence of Darren's financial misconduct. He enlisted the help of Sarah, the trusted employee who had first alerted him to the irregularities. Together, they combed through company records, isolating suspicious transactions and tracing the money Darren had funneled into his private account. At home, things with Emma were even worse. She was cold and distant, barely speaking to Michael unless it was to argue. Any mention of Darren turned into a shouting match. "You're obsessed," she told him one night, her voice sharp and accusing. "You're going to destroy everything because you can't let this go." Michael wanted to shout back, to tell her that she was the one destroying everything, but he didn't have the energy. Instead, he turned his focus back to the company. He told himself that if he could get Darren out of the picture, maybe he could salvage what was left of his life. While Michael was building his case, Darren caught wind of what was happening. It didn't take long for him to figure out that Michael was digging into the company's finances. Darren wasn't stupid. He knew how to cover his tracks, but he also knew how to play the game. Darren started planting seeds of doubt among the board members and key employees. He claimed that Michael was becoming erratic, that his obsession with control was driving the company into the ground. "I'm worried about his judgment," Darren said during one meeting, his tone dripping with concern. "We need to be prepared for the possibility that Michael isn't fit to lead anymore." The rumors spread quickly, and tensions at Solis Innovations reached a boiling point. Employees began whispering about disagreements at the top, and board members started questioning Michael's decisions. Darren's strategy was working. He was turning people against Michael while positioning himself as the reasonable, stable leader the company needed. Emma, meanwhile, was caught in the middle. She continued to deny any affair with Darren, insisting that Michael's accusations were baseless. But at the same time, she confided in Darren about her frustrations with Michael. She told him about the fights, about how distant Michael had become, about how she felt trapped in a marriage that was falling apart. Darren used this to fuel his resentment, painting Michael as the villain in every conversation. The breaking point came at a board meeting that had been called to address ongoing concerns about the company's leadership. Michael knew it was a setup. Darren had been working behind the scenes, rallying support for a vote of no confidence. But Michael wasn't about to back down. The meeting started with polite formalities, but it didn't take long for things to escalate. Darren opened the discussion by subtly undermining Michael's leadership, pointing to recent instability and questionable decisions. "I'm not saying Michael hasn't done great things for this company," Darren said, his voice measured and calm. "But lately, there have been issues that we can't ignore. Mismanagement of resources, erratic behavior, and a lack of transparency. For the sake of Solis Innovations, we need to consider whether it's time for a change at the top." Michael's jaw tightened as he listened. When Darren finished, he stood up, his voice steady but firm. "I'm not going to sit here and let you rewrite history, Darren. Everyone in this room knows I've been the one keeping this company afloat. And while we're talking about transparency, maybe we should discuss your little side accounts." The room fell silent. Darren's confident expression faltered for a split second before he recovered. "What are you talking about?" he asked, feigning confusion. Michael pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "This is a preliminary report on where some of our funds have been going over the past year. Care to explain why hundreds of thousands of dollars are missing and showing up in an account under your name?" Gasps and murmurs spread through the room as board members leaned forward to look at the documents. Darren's face turned red, but he forced a laugh. "This is ridiculous. You're trying to frame me because you know you're losing control. I don't have to explain anything to you." Michael leaned in, his voice low but sharp. "You're a thief, Darren. You've been stealing from this company and lying to everyone here. Don't act like you're the victim." The argument spiraled from there, with Darren and Michael shouting over each other as the board tried to regain control of the meeting. Darren accused Michael of paranoia, claiming he was fabricating evidence to distract from his own failures. Michael fired back, laying out the details of Darren's scheme and challenging him to prove his innocence. By the end of the meeting, the board was divided. Some members sided with Michael, shocked by the evidence he'd presented. Others seemed swayed by Darren's calm demeanor and pointed attacks on Michael's leadership. No decisions were made that day, but the damage was done. As Michael left the meeting, he felt a mix of anger and despair. Darren wasn't just fighting back, he was winning. The man who had once been his best friend was now his greatest enemy, and Michael wasn't sure how much longer he could hold the company together. Darren, on the other hand, walked out of the meeting with a smug smile. He knew he had bought himself more time, and he wasn't going to waste it. The battle for Solis Innovations was far from over, but Darren was determined to come out on top, no matter what it took. At home that night, Michael sat alone in his office, staring at the documents he'd collected. He had thought the evidence would be enough to turn everyone against Darren, but it hadn't gone the way he'd hoped. Emma walked in, her expression wary. "How did the meeting go?" she asked. Michael looked up at her, his eyes tired. "About as well as you'd expect," he said bitterly. Emma sighed and sat down across from him. "Michael, maybe it's time to let this go. All this fighting, it's tearing you apart." Michael shook his head. "I can't let him win, Emma. He's lying, and he's destroying everything we built. I won't let him get away with it." Emma didn't respond. She just sat there, her silence saying more than any words could. For Michael, the war with Darren wasn't just about the company anymore. It was personal, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting before everything came crashing down. Michael had reached his limit. Weeks of paranoia and half-truths had finally pushed him to the breaking point. Emma's evasiveness, Darren's constant manipulations, and the growing tensions at Solis Innovations had turned his once stable life into chaos. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to back down this time. One evening, after Emma returned home from another mysterious work meeting, Michael confronted her. She barely had time to set her purse down before he cornered her in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low but firm. Emma sighed, already defensive. "Not this again, Michael. I've told you." "Cut the crap," Michael interrupted, his patience gone. "I'm done playing games, Emma. I know about the dinners, the trips, the jewelry. I know it's Darren. Just tell me the truth." Emma froze, her eyes darting away. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said weakly. "Don't lie to me," Michael snapped, his voice rising. "I've been connecting the dots for weeks. I'm not an idiot, Emma. Just tell me the truth. Are you having an affair with Darren?" For a moment, she said nothing. Then, as if a dam had broken, Emma burst into tears. "Yes," she shouted, her voice cracking. "Okay. Yes, I am. Is that what you wanted to hear?" Michael stared at her, his chest tight. Even though he'd suspected it, hearing her admit it felt like a punch to the gut. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma wiped at her tears, unable to meet his gaze. "It started during one of your trips last year," she said quietly. "You were gone so much, Michael. I was lonely, and Darren, he was there." Michael clenched his fists, his anger boiling over. "Lonely? So you turned to him? My best friend? The guy who's been stealing from me and stabbing me in the back?" Emma flinched but didn't respond. "He manipulated you, didn't he?" Michael pressed. "He saw an opening and took it." Emma nodded, but her agreement didn't ease Michael's rage. "He told me you didn't care anymore," she said softly, "that you were too busy with the company to notice me. I was stupid, Michael. I believed him." Her words stung, but Michael couldn't tell if it was anger, betrayal, or heartbreak that hurt the most. "Stupid doesn't even begin to cover it," he muttered. Emma's tears started again, but Michael had nothing more to say. He turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. In the days following Emma's confession, Michael threw himself into work, desperate for something to distract him from the chaos at home. That's when Sarah approached him with another bombshell. "I've been digging deeper into Darren's activities," she said, placing a folder on Michael's desk. He's not just stealing money. He's preparing to launch a new company. Michael's heart sank as he flipped through the folder. Inside were documents outlining plans for a startup that sounded eerily similar to Solis Innovations. Worse, some of the technology Darren planned to use was proprietary, developed and patented by Michael's team. He's already pitching this to investors, Sarah continued. If he gets funding, he could launch within months. Michael slammed the folder shut, his anger surging. He's not just trying to take me down, he muttered. He's trying to replace me. This wasn't just business anymore. Darren's betrayal was personal, and Michael wasn't going to let him get away with it. A few days later, Darren extended an olive branch, or at least that's how it seemed. He called Michael, his tone friendly and conciliatory. Hey man, Darren said. I know things have been rough between us lately, but I want to make things right. There's a gala coming up this weekend, one of those big industry events. Why don't you and Emma come? It'll be a good chance to clear the air and show everyone we're still a team. Michael didn't buy it for a second. He knew Darren too well to believe this was a genuine attempt at reconciliation. Still, he agreed to go, if only to see what Darren was really up to. Emma, on the other hand, was hesitant. Do you really think this is a good idea? She asked. No, Michael admitted, but I need to know what he's planning. The night of the gala, Michael dressed in his sharpest suit, determined to maintain a calm exterior no matter what happened. Emma, though clearly nervous, did her best to play the role of supportive wife. As they walked into the grand ballroom, Michael's mind raced with possibilities. Darren was up to something. Michael could feel it. And whatever it was, he was determined to be ready. The room was packed with industry leaders, investors, and journalists, all mingling under glittering chandeliers. Darren greeted Michael and Emma with his usual charm, acting as if nothing was wrong. Glad you could make it, he said with a grin. Michael forced a smile. Wouldn't miss it. But as the night wore on, Michael kept a close eye on Darren, waiting for the moment when his true intentions would reveal themselves. Little did Michael know, the events of that night would push everything past the point of no return. The gala was in full swing, the ballroom alive with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. Michael moved through the crowd with practiced composure, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands, but his focus never wavered. His eyes were locked on Darren, who was mingling confidently, laughing with guests, and basking in the attention. Emma stayed close to Michael's side for most of the evening, but he could feel the tension radiating off her. Neither of them was comfortable, and they both knew why. It wasn't long before Darren and Emma found their way to each other. Michael noticed them slipping toward the far end of the room, near the grand staircase that led to a quieter lounge area. His stomach tightened as he watched them, their heads close as they spoke in hushed tones. Michael hesitated for a moment, debating whether to follow them. But the memory of Emma's confession and Darren's endless betrayals drove him forward. Quietly, he made his way closer, keeping out of sight, but close enough to hear their conversation. You've got him right where you want him, Darren said, his voice low but full of smug confidence. He's running around trying to dig up dirt on me, but it's too late. The company's already mine, and so are you. Emma looked uneasy, but she didn't argue. Darren laughed softly, shaking his head. Michael's such an idiot. He doesn't even see it. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll all be over. Michael froze, the words hitting him like a freight train. For weeks, he had been trying to hold everything together, clinging to the hope that he could salvage his company, his marriage, and his reputation. But hearing Darren gloat about taking everything from him, his work, his wife, his pride, was too much. He stepped forward, his voice sharp and cutting through the quiet. You really think you've won, don't you? Emma gasped, stepping back as Michael emerged from the shadows. Darren's smug smile faltered for a moment before returning, this time with a condescending edge. Michael, he said casually, didn't expect to see you here. Eavesdropping, are we? Michael ignored the jab, his focus locked on Darren. I've put up with your lies, your theft, and your pathetic attempts to destroy everything I've built. But this is a new low, even for you. Darren chuckled, his tone mocking. Oh, spare me the righteous speech. You've always acted like you're so much better than everyone else. Like you're the genius who makes it all happen. Newsflash, Michael, without me, you're nothing. And you know it. The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of a few nearby guests who started to whisper among themselves. Emma tried to step between them, her voice shaking. Michael, please, not here. Let's talk about this later. But Michael wasn't listening. His anger boiled over as Darren's words echoed in his mind. You're a thief and a coward, he spat. And I'm not going to let you walk away with everything I've worked for. Darren smirked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh, please. Do you even hear yourself? You sound pathetic. Face it, Michael. You've already lost. The company's mine, and Emma? Well, you've seen how that turned out. That was the breaking point. Michael lunged at Darren, shoving him backward into a nearby table. The room went silent as guests turned to watch the commotion, their expressions a mix of shock and curiosity. Darren recovered quickly, his smirk replaced by a glare. What the hell is wrong with you? He snapped, shoving Michael back. Michael's rage was uncontrollable now. You ruined my life, he shouted, his voice trembling with emotion. The two men grappled, their argument escalating into a full-blown altercation. Emma screamed, begging them to stop, but neither of them listened. Michael's hand gripped something from the table, his vision blurred with anger. He acted without thinking, directing his frustration toward Darren, who staggered under the weight of the conflict, leaving the guests frozen in disbelief. Darren stumbled, his eyes wide with shock as he crumpled to the floor. Gasps erupted from the crowd, and someone yelled for security. Michael stood over Darren, his chest heaving as he tried to process what had just happened. Emma rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside Darren. Oh my God, Darren, she cried, her voice breaking. She looked up at Michael, her face a mix of fear and anger. What have you done? Michael's focus shifted to Emma, and his anger flared again. Don't you dare act like you're innocent in this, he said, his voice cold and accusing. You're just as guilty as he is. Emma tried to stand, but Michael stepped toward her, his frustration and heartbreak spilling over. You lied to me, Emma. You betrayed me. I didn't mean for this to happen, she sobbed, holding her hands up defensively. Michael shook his head, his voice rising. You destroyed everything we had. In his rage, he shoved her backward. Emma stumbled, losing her balance and falling hard against the edge of the table. The room erupted into chaos as guests screamed and security rushed in. Michael stood frozen, his mind racing as he looked at the scene before him. Darren lay motionless on the floor, and Emma was crumpled nearby, her sobs fading into silence. The weight of what he'd done hit him all at once, and he dropped the statue, the loud clang echoing through the room. Security grabbed him, pulling his arms behind his back as the police arrived. Michael didn't resist. He didn't fight back. He simply stood there, numb, as the officers cuffed him and led him away. The grand ballroom, once filled with celebration, was now a scene of devastation. Guests huddled together, whispering in shock as the ambulance arrived. The glittering chandeliers and polished floors seemed out of place amidst the chaos, a cruel reminder of what the night was supposed to be. Michael glanced back once as they let him out, his face blank. He had spent his life building something he thought would last forever, only to watch it crumble in a single night. The aftermath of the confrontation was pure chaos. Guests screamed and scattered as others rushed to Darren and Emma's sides. Darren lay motionless on the floor while Emma, struggling to sit up, was surrounded by a growing crowd. The grand ballroom, once buzzing with celebration, was now filled with panic and confusion. Michael stood frozen in the middle of it all, his chest heaving as the reality of what had just happened sank in. He made no attempt to run or resist as the venue's security approached, detaining him until the police arrived. When the officers entered, they found Michael standing quietly, his face blank. He didn't argue or resist as they handcuffed him and led him out of the building. By the time the ambulance arrived to take Darren and Emma away, Michael was already gone, leaving behind a room filled with stunned onlookers and shattered dreams. The trial that followed became a media sensation. Headlines painted Michael as the betrayed husband whose life had unraveled in the most public and tragic way. Every detail of the affair and the betrayal was laid bare in court, feeding the public's fascination. Michael's defense team argued that his actions had been a result of overwhelming emotional distress, a crime of passion triggered by the ultimate betrayal from his wife and best friend. The jury deliberated for days before reaching their verdict, guilty. Michael was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10. The night of the gala left a trail of shattered lives and irreversible consequences for everyone involved.